Mónica Guzmán, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Um, we are once again in a political time that is very emotional, in which it is very easy to start thinking not just that certain people in positions of high authority, but perhaps also those who support them, must be ill-intentioned, must have the wrong kind of values, must want or wish ill on people. And I can feel in the political culture rising again the kind of proud refusal of dialogue with others. The proud, I don't even want to talk to those people because of all of the evil that they're doing and the fact that they're probably terrible human beings. Do you ever waver from the importance and the need to speak to people across the political divide, or how would you make the case in this fraught political moment that it really is important for Americans to continue speaking to each other, irrespective of where they are on the political spectrum?
Yeah. Oh, that's the question right now. Because you're right, I have sensed a few steps back for folks. There's so much fear and there's so much uncertainty. And there's all kinds of swift action that's making a lot of folks on the left just pretty freaked out. Some folks on the right too. But do I waver from the idea that it is critically important to talk to folks across political difference? No, not at all. In fact, I feel more committed to that than ever because of the fear and the uncertainty that's sweeping across the whole country right now, because of how it feels like reactionary politics and a sense of recklessness is more kind of normal. It makes perfect sense to me, given the recklessness and rashness and reactionary nature of the way we talk to each other. I just think that the way we talk affects the way we think, and the way we think affects the way we act. And that's that. And so when we silo ourselves, when we tell ourselves there's nothing to learn over there, and that all those things are actually going to bury us in a deeper hole, we end up creating the hole. That's what creates the hole. So for as much as people say there will be harm if I talk to this person, there's harm in that idea, and so therefore opening the box of that idea by talking to that person releases harm. And kind of what I say to that is, look, even if there may be harm in some of those things in some situations. The deepest harm comes from our non-engagement. The least democratic thing we can do is disengage and continue to participate in a vicious cycle where we are judging each other more while we engage each other less. So if you follow that to its logical conclusion, what are our judgments based on? It's not what each other actually thinks. It's just the hearsay, the hyperbole, the media signals. We are spinning away from each other. That is the most anti-democratic thing that there is.
So I think, lots of Americans continue to be in very mixed political environments, and that's important to remember. But especially in the more elite circles of America, I think that there are many who've just entered political bubbles, whether that is a deeply conservative political bubble in some affluent town or suburb in a more red-leaning state like Alabama or perhaps Tennessee, or whether that is the kind of more progressive bubble that you and I, and not to presume probably more of my listeners, are more accustomed to in certain colleges in New York and LA and certain other big cities in the country. Now, I think if you're in a bubble like that, it makes you a little bit nervous to speak to people who are very different in terms of the basic worldviews and the basic assumptions. Yeah. You may not have built up the skill to actually respect each other across that amount of political distance, and so all of that might engender some apprehension and fear. But I think the most fundamental obstacle is not that fear and that apprehension, and I want to get in the conversation to a point of you telling us how to learn how to speak to each other in a better way. It's actually the kind of invented set of reasons for why we shouldn't even speak to each other, right? There's a set of justifications and rationalizations for why I shouldn't even have to expose myself to that discomfort. Because by definition, if this person doesn't agree with my view on the Trump administration, or if this person doesn't agree with my view on racial justice, or if this person doesn't agree with my view on trans issues, then they're just not a good person, right? Yeah. They're just not worthy of equal respect. And perhaps it's pointless, because since they're driven by ill will, since they're driven by a lack of respect for the things I care about, they're not a good faith participant in this dialogue. And of course, I sort of assumed here a set of progressive frames, but conservatives of a certain form might have exactly the same set of defenses. They might say, well, look, I'm a patriot and I care about this country, and those people on the other side, they don't even care about their country. They worship weird satanic ideas, right? They just want to destroy the social order. They're not operating in good faith. Why should I even speak to them? Why should I even have these conversations? So what argument would you make to those people? Why is it that we should assume good faith in a political moment in which it does seem like, at least at the level of high politics, a lot of people do seem to be behaving in bad faith, or reveling in the cruelty in various ways, in which a lot of our political class does seem to be quite selfish and perhaps narcissistic. Why is it that we should still afford the grace of assuming good intentions to people with whom we have these fundamental differences?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, in your recounting of the barriers people face and feel to engagement across the divide, you mentioned a lot of things with certainty that are pretty uncertain on a case-by-case basis, and that we have evidence that we tend to misperceive with enormous frequency. So things like they're motivated by ill will. They have malevolent intent. And that's easy to pick up in signals about other people. But if you don't get close enough to folks, it's almost impossible to determine that. A lot of the times, it's that they don't have the same variables that you do, the variables that you used in your equation to make your political choice. It's easy to fall into the cognitive fallacy of what you see is what you get, and so those are all the variables there are. And therefore, if somebody came to a different choice, it must be because they're a bad person. They took these same variables and they came out with this. Like, that's crazy. But it isn't when you get close enough to see that there are other variables in play. There's lots of social research that shows over and over again that across the political divide, we misperceive, we exaggerate tremendously, and this is both sides. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are acting in bad faith. That doesn't mean that there aren't people who are, for example, so consumed by hate that they are worth fearing. That, yes. But every time we've asked the question and tried to kind of scientifically take a look, we see that we're getting it wrong all the time. All the time. And so if we're getting it wrong all the time, we can't have a lot of confidence in that sense, even the sense that they disagree with me on trans issues, they disagree with me on abortion, they disagree with me on immigration. What exactly do they disagree with you on or not when it comes to immigration and abortion? We also see over and over again that issues like that are a lot more nuanced than we give them credit for. And there's an enormous overlap, for example, on immigration policy, when you actually ask people what they believe. But the perceptions people have make it look like we're just living on two different planets. But it's not even true. But we can't realize it's not true until we get close enough to check that with each other, because our media signals are incentivized to just push us to the edges all the time. So that's one thing. So there's that. There's the uncertainty of, are you even sure they disagree? Like, to what extent? On which things? What if there's more common ground there than you think? And then
and
there's...
Just to speak to that for a moment, there's great research, for example, by our friends at More in Common,
yes.
About this issue. And so I remember one particularly, which was more about perceptions of American history, but there's other lines of research that they published as well. On that one, most progressives in America think that conservatives don't want to teach the history of slavery in schools. that they don't think of Martin Luther King Jr. as an American hero, and so on. And that is simply wrong, right? You ask conservatives, and they do want to teach about slavery in schools. Not every single one, but a huge majority. And they do think of Martin Luther King as a hero. The same way, the other way around, you ask Republicans or conservatives how they perceive the views of Democrats, and they're going to see, well, Democrats think that patriotism is a bad thing, and they think that George Washington was a bad person. And you look at Democrats, and that's not true. They actually, in a majority, think that patriotism is good, and that George Washington, was a heroic founder of the United States. And so, that would allow you to come to a more subtle set of views where both of those sets of things are true at the same time.
Right.
American history is deeply beset by the legacy and the history of slavery, and that is a fundamental thing about this country. And yet, we have very good reasons to celebrate the founders for the great accomplishments, flawed as they may have been in certain respects. That actually has a majority support in the United States, but most Americans don't think that it has majority support in that kind of way.
And as a result, most Americans are having projected debates. They're not even real debates. They're happening at a performative level, and they're not grounded in what people actually think. They're only grounded in what people think people think. And so we're like these layers away from reality right now. I always talk about this, but there was a meme that I saw a couple of years ago, and it said something to the effect of, I think it was, I choose the second grader over the Second Amendment. And I saw it in my Facebook feed, and my, lizard brain instantly felt good because I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive, and I saw that meme and I saw the rhetorical symmetry just made it land in my brain like second grader, Second Amendment. Isn't that lovely? It's all packaged so nicely. And I felt so good because, I choose the second grader over the Second Amendment too. And then I went, wait a second. This debate on guns is not between do you choose the Second Amendment of our Constitution, or do you want to, kill second graders? Do you not care about their lives? That is not the actual debate. That's just how we have the debate to elicit outrage, to kind of hack into our emotions and have the projected debate that takes up so much of our time and so much of our cycles. So that's the thing, is like if people are motivated and having actual debates or even realizing what the real divisions are, then you can't have a personal policy of disengagement on all these issues, because you will be led astray. We are having projected debates everywhere, and very few of us are having the actual debates.
And so you're about to say that sort of one point is, well, perhaps our views are not as different from each other as we think. And I think you were about to say a second point before I shared this research from Mónica.
Right. The other thing is, if you feel really strongly about your views, awesome, that's great. We all need our convictions and our passions. Then chances are you really want there to be a world where more folks agree with you and more folks see it your way. And you want the way you think about things to matter. And so you want persuasion to be effective in American life. And persuasion cannot be effective in American life if we are not engaging across political difference in ways that people can both hear and be heard. So the more that you shame, the more that you vilify, the more that you push people away from wanting to hear you, and the more that you push yourself away from wanting to hear them, you're going to assume all those bad intents. You're going to make the pernicious assumption that, people who disagree with you on these very core things must be crazy, stupid, or evil. Or you're going to believe another cognitive fallacy that if you oppose what I support, you must hate what I love. And you're going to give yourself a sort of moral reason not to engage. But again, if your goal is to fight for this cause, if your goal is to make this reality that's in your head as the ideal, the reality of the world around you, nothing except for genuine good faith engagement with your actual opponent, first to see if they really are your opponent in the ways that you project, because as I always say, whoever is underrepresented in your life is going to be overrepresented in your imagination. You've got to correct your imagination with reality, and you have to get close to their perspective, their true perspective, one way or another. So there's that. And then if you can have the conversations where you're heard, or you're at least seen and have to be kind of, abided in one way or another, then persuasion might really work. But it's going to take a lot for persuasion to come back into American life, given the depth of distrust that exists. And I think that's just the deepest harm of all. When people are afraid of what harm can come from engaging across difference, the deepest harm is what's been created, this debris, this detritus, this dearth of kind of the substrate that we need to be able to build these kinds of conversations. We can't do it if we keep each other at arm's length and we believe that we're everything is just going to be harmed by our having these conversations.
So let me enumerate some of the ways that I agree, and then try to steelman the sort of response from the person who wants to refuse in engaging in this kind of conversation, right?
Yeah.
So I agree with you that actually we probably agree about a lot more things than the extreme polarization of our public discourse indicates. You see that in opinion polls very clearly. You see that if you spend time watching focus groups as well. That relates to the second point, which is that by and large, when you do have real disagreements about something, they're not that the values of the person on the other side of the argument are completely cruel, or that in their own mind they just say, I don't care about any of these people. It's that they're prioritizing other values, they're prioritizing another way of thinking about the situation, which leads them to a different set of values, different set of conclusions. But the arguments they have are in themselves legible and in themselves honorable, even if I, from my vantage point, might think that they ultimately come to the wrong conclusion. I think that's, broadly speaking, right. Now, the point where you might get pushback is to say, all right, but even though there might be some things we agree on, and even though I might sympathetically understand how they came to the wrong conclusion about those things where we do disagree, the stakes are really high right now, right? We're trying to figure out whether to continue supporting Ukraine, and I'm obviously betraying my own political views here, but whether to support Ukraine in a defensive war against an aggressor that's trying to annex a lot of its territory, or whether to be a kind of neutral arbiter between those two things as though they were on the same moral plane. We're debating, I have complex issues on trans issues, but I think there's just absolutely no reason to think that trans people shouldn't be able to, aren't capable of serving in the military. And we're debating whether we should, fire people from the positions they currently hold in the military on the basis of being trans. And that's going to, really impact the lives, the careers, the life conceptions of a lot of people, some of whom may be political activists of some sort, most of whom probably just want to serve a country and do their job well and lead their lives, right? So, when somebody says, all right, under those circumstances, yes, perhaps if I really listen to the arguments that people have, they might be making some strong points. There might be some honorable set of reasons how they came to this view. But in the end, what matters is that they're on the wrong side of an important moral issue. And why should I sort of waste time speaking to them, trying to persuade them, rather than rallying my own side, making sure that we're activated to fight for this important cause? Isn't that what's more important in a moment like that? How would you respond to that kind of, I think, quite
objection? No, it's a great point. And my response briefly is that you can't do the latter without doing some of the former. You can't fight for your cause and be an effective activist in this world with its media culture as it is and its political culture as it is and the divisions and what they've wrought without checking your projections of what you're even fighting against with the reality. You are going to waste a lot of cycles if you're fighting ghosts. You're going to live maybe more scared too if you think that the monster is bigger than it actually is. Activism has become really uninformed in the ways that it needs to be because of this lack of dialogue. And look, I think part of the point you're bringing up and the view you're representing is that dialogue is not sufficient, and I could not agree more. I think that there is a danger in dialogue for its own sake, or dialogue that is supposed to supplant action. Like, no, that doesn't make sense. There are high stakes issues out there, but what I see is avoidance that's being conflated with courage. Like all the times that people who think of themselves as doing really good by their cause, write a social media post that really, really takes down the other argument and gets tons of likes. Have they persuaded anyone on the other side? Have they effectuated change with that? And the answer is no, because it's mostly siloed anyway. And if someone on the other side is looking at what you've said, they're doing it from a mindset of picking up ammo from what you've said and launching it back at you. There is very little courage in such a divided world in shaming the other side for what they believe. It doesn't work. And my favorite example about this comes from Megan Phelps Roper. Are you familiar with her and her work? She was a member of the Westboro Baptist Church, which was famous for, protesting funerals, really, really cruel things, holding up signs that say things like "God hates fags" and awful, awful stuff like that, and considered, a hate group by many people. Megan was, very devout within the church and really believed in it, and she ended up being converted out of it. But while she was in it, she discovered Twitter, and so she put the church's, messages out there, pretty hateful stuff. And when she got hate back, when she got shame for her beliefs, she didn't interpret them as reasons to revisit her own beliefs at all. At all. She looked at it as, it's working. We're getting attention. We're getting people, woken up to this. And she has said, since her conversion sort of away from that, and she's disowned those beliefs since, it's an amazing story. But she has said that she ran into this definition of shame, that shame is that feeling you get when you realize you violated the norms of your community. The thing is, the key word is your community. If you realize you violated the norms of another community, then who cares? If you consider that side to be so anti-you that they're the enemy, then who cares, right? So again, an activism that makes more slogans, more posters, and throws it at the enemy like grenades. They're not effective. They're not doing what you think they're doing. But what converted Megan Phelps Roper out of her hateful beliefs was when people on Twitter started actually engaging with her generously and listening to her from a very safe distance of Twitter. And over time, they helped her see the contradictions in her own beliefs, and it was a long journey, but it was thanks to that listening that she got to step outside of her world and say, wait a second, what is this? So I think a lot of real change happens with a combination of action, judicious action that's strategic and smart, combined with good faith dialogue, behind the scenes if it needs to, one-on-one here and there. Check in with what the opposition really is and check in with those folks. Because if you do that, you're going to figure out what you're really up against, instead of sort of the status-seeking performance that, is just making more theater for us to divide ourselves around.
That's really interesting. I mean, I have a reflection that's loosely related to that about cancel culture. There's always this debate for the last 10 years about whether cancel culture is on the left or whether cancel culture is on the right, and isn't the right-wing form of cancel culture just as bad as the left-wing form of cancel culture. And I think the insight that you shared is the core to interpreting this, which is that, if you're in left-leaning institutions, the right-wing cancel culture is completely irrelevant to you. Because when the supposed adversary or opponent criticizes you, that is an honor, right? The fact that Fox News gets upset about something you wrote might lead to some really unpleasant emails in your inbox, but to just about every professor in the country, that is something where they turn up on campus the next day, and whether they admit it to themselves or not, they have a little proud smile. And if a colleague say, oh my God, I saw Fox News attacked you, they know that that's going to lead them to rise in the estimation of their colleague. So there's no shame involved in that. It's actually a reason for pride. If it's your own side that is attacking you, right? If it's your own side that says, actually, this professor is secretly racist, homophobic, sexist, whatever it is, then you're fearing the next faculty meeting. Then you're fearing showing up the next day. Now, of course, if your social circle or your professional circle or your audience is right-leaning, then the opposite is true, right? If you're a conservative commentator and MSNBC gets upset about you, well, you have that same slightly smug, proud smile, you know? I mean, this is going to validate to your followers that you're on their side and that you're courageous. It's going to make you a kind of little martyr, right? Well, actually, if it's Fox News that says, you obliquely criticize President Trump and that's really unacceptable, or some big account on Twitter that calls you out as a rhino, as a Republican in name only, an acronym that's slightly died out recently, actually. Perhaps a Mino, somebody who's MAGA.
I don't know what the term is now.
Someone, then you're worried because that's your social circle that's suddenly criticizing you, right? So I think that's a very important point you make. And on persuasion, I think it's absolutely right that we tend to think of our political system as stuck, because every election for the last 10 or 15 years has been pretty tight. And so it feels as though this is sort of liberal America standing against conservative America, and it's just a question of mobilization. But I've argued for a long time that is a misreading just simply of the electoral data, because you look at who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and those two groups are very different, strikingly different from who voted for Donald Trump in 2024 and who voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. So even for the net flows between those two groups were relatively similar. There's a lot of people who are persuaded in both directions. And so actually I think there's much more scope for persuasion in this moment. Now, I guess it raises the question of, is the case for persuasion instrumental? Is it intrinsic, or is it both? Do you think that it's important for activists to engage in persuasion because actually you can persuade people? It is actually an effective way of serving the goal of making sure that America continues to stand with countries like Ukraine, that we don't treat ill trans service members who just want to be able to serve in the military. Is it this kind of an instrumental, this is one cool hack to actually win the political scene? Or is there a more fundamental argument that irrespective of the efficacy of this kind of engagement, it's the right thing to do? And if so, why? Why should we care about it above and beyond the ways in which it might just be instrumentally helpful for us in advancing our political cause?
Right. Oh, what a fascinating question. I mean, it is instrumental. I think there's techniques in politics like deep canvassing, which is, a technique where folks who are fighting for a certain cause, let's say LGBTQ issues, which is where it's been used in many campaigns, they knock on doors and they come inside and they talk for an hour, mostly asking questions of folks about their beliefs. And what deep canvassing does is it helps people actually unpack what they believe and take a look at it, in the presence of someone who's curious and interested. And then sometimes when people do that, it's such a gift, because how often are we confronted with our own opinion in that generous way that invites us to explore it? And when people do that, they often realize that there's sort of these tensions that are really tricky, and then they'll choose to resolve it a different way, and they'll end up changing their minds. My friend David McRaney, who wrote a book called How Minds Change, most incredible book on persuasion I've ever read, sums it up as all persuasion is self-persuasion. So it is instrumental in that when you approach somebody, across political difference, and you represent yourself and you are there, you are there. Maybe you represent something that they believe they disagree on and all of that. And you ask questions generously and you invite them to explore their own perspectives, then they'll do that for a while and they may change their own minds. So all persuasion is self-persuasion. So it's instrumental in that way. You actually will make some progress. Also, you were asking, is there a principle here that goes deeper? And I think there absolutely is. There's so many benefits that I've seen people taste from doing things like this. And the one that comes to mind now, especially thinking about the current moment, is the world becomes a less scary place. And it's nice to live in a world that is less scary. There's, a lot of the anxiety I think that people are feeling right now on the left. And this is not to diminish the very real awful things that are happening. I've had people lose their jobs, because of what's going on with the federal government. I've got folks in universities like traumatized right now. It's terrible. But what makes the trauma and the fear so much worse is a sense that all these people on the other side want me to be hurt. All these people on the other side want these horrible things for me. And combined with a sense of hopelessness, because they are crazy, stupid, or evil, because, they oppose what I support, therefore they must hate what I love. And I'm not having conversations with people to recognize some common ground, or to even show them some of the pain I'm feeling that gets them to kind of go, oh, when you don't have that, the world is it's a tough world to want to even be an agent around. And people end up silencing themselves and diminishing themselves. I've seen it happen with a lot of folks in my world. And that's not what we want. That's not what we want. And I think if we could see the truth of what's in people's hearts, my guess is that it would not match the level of severity that we project onto them. And so what happens if you lift at least some of that off? Well, what happens is you become more powerful. You are able to be more creative. We know this from the neurobiology of fear, right? When you're afraid, and we are all the descendants of people who ran away from the bear, fear is a superpower. It has saved us. It is great. But don't waste your fear on anything but danger, because fear will also shut down your ability to judge. It will shut down your ability to be creative and to be collaborative. And in order to actually solve the problems we have, and to have the debates about Ukraine, and to have the conversations about trans issues, that the more that we don't have the conversations, the worse things seem to get, then you're going to see that you're going to see the nuance there, and you're going to see the goodness in people's hearts who disagree with you, because it's there. It's there. And once you see that, you're going to be like, oh, if the world's a little less scary, then I can maybe think better into the world, and I can be a more effective change agent in the direction that I want to go. And there's one other piece of this, and this also comes from this extraordinary book, How Minds Change, and David's work. But one thing about persuasion that is so important is that if somebody that you're talking to feels a lot of belonging around their beliefs, and maybe it is, to take kind of a deviant example, it's 9/11's conspiracy theorist, for example. There's a lot of belonging in that community, the truther community, and they're very, very close knit to each other. So there's a cost to changing your mind. There's a cost for some communities, because there's so many, threads to belonging and a sense of identity around what you believe. So if we're going to get underneath that to really persuade all these folks who have really made their opinions their identity, then what we need to do is we need to give them another home. They feel at home in their identity. Well, if they're going to change their mind, they have to feel that there's another home to go to when you have this different belief. And if we are just hostile and shaming and excluding and burning bridges, then there is no home for people to change their minds into. There is no other community to join, and therefore the cost is too high. And their minds and their hearts will ensure that they never change their minds. And this applies to all of us. The more that this is about our identities, this locks our world into a place where sort of, classically liberal things can't even move anymore. And we have to be able to move each other.
That's really interesting and powerful. I always thought that conspiracy theory can actually be quite comforting. I think I may have said this once or twice on the podcast, because the truth of it is that the world is complicated and chaotic, and nobody has full control over it, and that means that things might spiral out of control, and that we might not be able to master certain kinds of problems. The idea of a conspiracy theory is superficially scary, because there's these bad people who have their designs on the world and they're kind of in control. But it's actually quite comforting because it suggests that if only we're able to replace them and uncover, the evil scheme and put decent people in power, then suddenly all of these problems are going to be solved. So it's actually a very comforting view. And it's interesting that you add to that the social element of how being part of a conspiracy theorist community can be really comforting, because it's people who are trying to figure this thing out with each other, and they're warm with each other, and they give each other affirmation and belonging. And so, losing your belief in a conspiracy theory is doubly scary, because I think it actually throws you into a view of a world that's more scary, where the easy solutions don't exist. And B, obviously, it means that those people who are supporting you and giving you validation may suddenly turn on you and say, you've been bought off. They're probably going to explain, respond with some kind of conspiracy theory about why you no longer believe in the conspiracy theory. Now, you're also right that on the other side, changing your mind from assuming that people on the other side of the political spectrum must be bad and evil to recognizing that they may actually have views which are noble and sensible in themselves, even if you ultimately disagree with what you should do, that they're motivated by decent considerations, makes the world a lot less scary. And here I think you're right to both point to the ways in which the kind of catastrophizing about what the other side of the political debate wants is both instrumentally, I think, misguided often, because it makes it much harder to persuade people. It makes it harder to understand the motives, to predict how they're going to act, to appeal to people who are undecided. And it just needlessly gives you this really lonely, scared place in the world. And that, too, I think, is particularly illustrated by parts of the trans debate. It's one thing to say, look, there's disagreements about the ease and the extent to which 13, 14, 15-year-olds should be able to undergo gender transitions. There's competing considerations at place here. And, if a progressive or somebody who's trans understands that, whether or not they have to ultimately agree with them, the people who have concerns in this area are motivated by the well-being of those children, right? They worry that this is not medically fully researched, that perhaps it's going to have really bad side effects that might last lifelong, that it might lead to these kids being infertile, being anorgasmic, that it might lead to some people having big regret and wanting to retransition. And even if you think we're wrong about all of those things, those are not evil motivations, right? Those are motivations that should be legible to everybody. But if you cast this as A, they deny my existence, and B, then by a verbal sleight of hand, they don't want me to exist. And by they don't want me to exist, it doesn't just mean they don't want me to exist in another gender. They don't want me personally to exist. They actually, in fact, would rather I don't exist. They would be happy if I was dead, which is a verbal sleight of hand that happens a lot in this discussion.
Yes,
well, that's a really scary view of a world, right? And anybody who encourages kids to have that view of a world should, I think, be really ashamed of themselves, because it is trying to get impressionable people to have a lot of fear that, for all of its genuinely high stakes in this debate, is often misplaced.
Yes, and it justifies the most extreme actions against, right? Because if someone's trying to kill you, then everything is on the table. Everything is self-defense. And a lot of our debates have gotten to that point where some of the most vocal proponents are acting with the force of a sense of all action is justified because the most vicious and cruel and horrible attacks are coming to us. And therefore we need to give the most, cruel and vicious things on the other side, but it's righteous, it's war. And it's remarkable that we've gotten to that place, and then you can look at statements like that closely and with a lot of heart, How do I engage with someone who thinks I shouldn't exist? There's several ways that you can come at this that gives you more power and less fear. And one of them is, okay, does someone thinking you shouldn't exist actually have any bearing on your existing? There you are existing. You're existing right now, right? But there's something in that belief that somehow gives And again, I'm just offering this. I'm not saying it's the entire story. I'm just offering this as an on-ramp to another frame. What if you are giving that other person power over the force of your existence by believing that their believing that you shouldn't exist somehow has a bearing on your existence? There you are existing. No matter what they think, you continue to exist, right? So you can think of that. And also, how do I engage with someone who thinks I shouldn't exist? My friend Manu Meal, who is the CEO of an organization called Bridge USA, extraordinary cross-partisan bridging in tons of college campuses all across the country. He's amazing, and what they do is amazing. So please check him out. He says, if the question you're asking yourself is, why should I talk to someone who thinks a whole group of people shouldn't exist? He goes, the better question is, what happens if you don't? What happens if you don't? How do you take yourself out of that? So if I can, let me tell you like a quick personal story, a bit vulnerable, that illustrates something that I think is quite powerful here. So many years ago in Seattle, I'm a millennial, I'm 42, so I'm of a certain generation, right? And generations just have things that are kind of native to us and things that are more new. And one of the things that's more new to me is different pronouns. So I'm at this theater waiting for a friend, and somebody comes up to me to introduce themselves to me. And I notice that they have these big long earrings. And one of the earrings says they, and the other earring says them. And instantly I can kind of feel that I'm made a bit uncomfortable because I'm uncomfortable with new pronouns. I'm being asked to share my pronouns. I don't really get it. And it's sort of strange. And so this person comes with their earrings, introduces themselves, and then walks off, and I just said hi, and that was it. For the next 20 minutes, if someone were to be looking at me, it looked like I was just sitting there, just waiting. What was actually happening is I was having a really passionate conversation with myself. And myself sort of split into two. There was sort of the part of me that was like, I don't know, these pronouns make me really uncomfortable. And then there was a part of me going, if I were like that person, wouldn't I want to have some ways of showing that how I see myself, the pronouns that I want, billboarded easily so that people know how to address me, so that I'm not constantly reminded that folks aren't seeing me the way I see myself. And so those two parts of me were just wrestling. And at the end of those 20 minutes, I felt a little less uncomfortable with new pronouns. New pronouns to me, right? And so I say all that because I think that sometimes the best way to argue against someone who thinks you shouldn't exist is to continue to exist in their presence. It doesn't all have to be a fight. It doesn't all have to be a logical string of arguments. We just have to continue to be present with each other. I have a good friend who's gay, and the day after the 2024 election, called him, and he said, and I said, yeah, what's your reaction? I had a lot of folks who were just staying home and feeling kind of afraid for all these reasons. And he said, yeah, today I am going to be as gay and as out there in the world and as proud of my gayness as I possibly can. And I saw something really empowering in that, and I'm choosing issues that are, sort of more friendly to the way the left views the world. But this can apply to folks, who believe that religious liberty is under threat in America. Folks who believe that, that there's just all kinds of things around patriotism, of love of country that are being disrespected. I've learned so much from the conservatives in my life, from my parents to some of my very best friends. So much, and I'm so grateful for the perspectives that they've given me permission to embrace. It's been wonderful. So anyway, yeah. What happens if you don't? What happens if you don't talk to folks who think a certain group shouldn't exist? Then I guess we'll all entrench in those views, and we'll just continue to be at war in a democracy, which makes no sense.
That's a great way of putting it. So let's assume that listeners are convinced by your case for the importance of actually engaging with each other by the stage of a conversation. If that is the case, what should one do? And what should listeners do who maybe perhaps some of them in a deeply conservative bubble somewhere, perhaps more of them in a deeply liberal or progressive bubble somewhere? How do you seek out those opportunities? And once you're in that conversation, what are the do's and the don'ts? What are the things that actually can open up meaningful conversations and experiences where perhaps you'll change somebody's mind, but even if you don't, you actually are able to see each other's humanity and to appreciate each other's point of view. And what are the things to be on the guard against? What are the things that happen when those conversations go off the rails?
Yeah, so I may ask you to remind me about the tiers of those as I kind of start addressing some of them. So how to seek out those opportunities. One misconception that I've run into a lot in this work is because there is such a fear about what might happen, what harms might come when we bridge these divides, I think people tend to think of the worst case scenario first. So let's be clear. I'm not saying the ask is not go talk to a Nazi tomorrow. The ask is not you're going to wake up in the morning and be a Zen master of curiosity. It's about wherever you are, find your edge. So that's the number one. Find your edge. Now, also, you might say, I'm in a really blue city like Seattle and all my friends are liberal. We agree on everything. And I would say, are you sure? Are you sure about that? Because the blindness of toxic polarization also blinds one side to itself and to the nuance that exists there. So I bet you know somebody who, will probably disagree with you on immigration, will probably disagree with you on abortion. So instead of assuming that you all agree just because you voted for the same candidate, go and ask about that and get into the weeds and you'll see that you actually do disagree. Build the muscle there. Practice there. So you don't have to seek opportunities with the person who is the most different from you. Now, the other thing, if you are with someone who is quite different from you, then cool. Here, the strategy is don't try to take it all in one bite. It's about short conversations. It's about bit by bit. There's a lot of research that shows that some of the best conversations are had while you're doing something. Not where you're sitting showdown style, facing each other. It's actually next to each other that is more productive as a conversation to try to get a little bit of understanding. Even if it's for 5 minutes, you're going to talk about what was on Fox News last night. 5 minutes, then you're going to move on, right? This is why conversations in cars are so awesome, because it's people sitting next to each other. It's incredible. This is why we make road trip movies and they're coming of age. Yes. I mean, cafes, I literally, if I'm meeting with someone and it's a cafe, I try not to sit across from them. I try to sit kitty corner, or I try to sit, sometimes there's like two cozy, little armchairs with like a nice little table in the middle. That is where I have my best coffee shop conversation. So take that one home with you.
I don't fully understand the point you're making. I know it's true. And to me, really, the sort of most obvious example of this is that there's something much more natural about developing intimacy and trust with each other, sitting in a cafe in a place like Paris where traditionally the seats are arranged such a way that you're looking out at the world, you're sitting next to each other, and somehow it allows your thoughts to wander more. It's a less intense. I don't understand what the mechanism is, but I fully agree with you that it's the case. But I don't know if you can explain to me why.
It's somatic. It's a lot about the body and what we do. I mean, we're mimetic creatures, right? So if research shows over and over again, if one person sort of tends to make a certain gesture, or if one person tends to use certain language even, we tend to kind of adopt each other's tones and mannerisms. When we are facing each other and we have fears about each other, and what if this person is judging me, things like that, then eye contact becomes uncomfortable, becomes a reminder of difference. It becomes a little trigger of fear. There's all kinds of things that can get activated that way. When you are next to each other, then many of us just tend to be a little more liberated from that. And so you can kind of slow it down. And it just kind of works. Now, that's the other thing is like, if you want to go talk to Uncle Bob about that tough thing that, that some Democratic politician is doing, some Republican politician is doing, like, and Uncle Bob likes to go fishing and you don't mind going fishing, go fishing with Uncle Bob and bring it up there when you're going fishing. So there's just these little tricks. But I'm really saying two things. And one thing is about kind of the somatic experience or the posture or the gesture or the approach to each other. But the other one is we tend to sometimes, kind of build this up in our heads. Like, I'm going to talk to Uncle Bob. He's going to give me the answers I need. I'm going to be really open. But then we have these big expectations. For example, I talked to Uncle Bob for an hour and I asked him all the questions and he never asked me any questions. He never asked me any questions. He didn't reciprocate. He wasn't being curious. It didn't work. I can't do, I'm not going to do that again. We're done. That's one thing people say. Or people just start to get really impatient. Why do you believe what you believe? And people go, well, okay, there's this and this. If you've built enough trust, maybe they'll tell you. But it doesn't satisfy you, and so you keep pushing. That's not right. No, I don't think so. You've got something else going on. Oh man, that'll just sink. That'll sink the conversation real fast. So you also asked, okay, what are some of the tips and tricks? What are the ways that you can open these conversations? And one of the biggest tips I have is, instead of asking why, ask how. Ask versions of the question how. Don't ask why do you disagree with me on abortion? Why do you think this way about Trump? Ask, how did you get to the place where, how did you come to believe what you believe about elections? How did you come to believe what you believe about the federal government? How is a question of story. It elicits stories. And who is the world's reigning expert on my story? Me. And who's the world's reigning expert on your story? You. So we get to kind of skirt around many of the accusations of sort of your sources are wrong. So that's one benefit. You get to ask that. But also, when people are in that showdown mode, when we have distrust across the divide and somebody asks you why you believe what you believe, you feel really on the spot. You feel really on the spot. And maybe you freeze a little bit in your mind because, this is going to be scary. And so what you do is you go and your mind searches for the talking points that you heard on social media. Or on the
Here's
news.
the thing I can say that proves what you were just saying. What about this fact?
Yes. And then you're not actually having the conversation about yourself and this other person and your actual beliefs. You tend to go and have the proxy conversations you've seen others have because, well, they've looked like mic drops on social media. That seemed to work, so let me use it. And I expect that it will work when I give this person this glittering reason that I find so powerful. It's like, it won't work. It's not going to change their mind.
Suddenly you're the kind of human megaphone of Twitter, right? You're just like reading out tweets that you liked over the course of the last 5 years out loud. I think that's very good advice. I also worry that it could lead to a conversation that falls into the opposite kind of trap, right? So when I think about politics, I've learned over the years that there's very smart people, very well-informed people with radically different views from mine. I've learned that it's very easy to get things wrong about politics, to have an assumption about what's going to happen that turns out to be really wrong, to really trust a politician and to find that politician is much more flawed, much more imperfect than you recognize. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that none of us have a full grasp of the truth. And particularly, and there's something I've written about a lot in the last weeks and months, that I think we're in a moment of very rapid change right now, and not enough people are sort of slowing down to think about what the nature of that change is and what's going to happen. You can be horrified by many of the things that are going on, and I am, but I don't think, just purely intellectually, that is a good excuse not to think really hard about why it is that some of the old order is breaking apart and what the range of possibilities are for what the new order that will come after it might look like. So, I think having a lot of epistemic humility is generally good, and it's particularly good in this moment. Now, what I don't believe is that politics is just a matter of my truth and your truth, right? What I don't believe is that ultimately there's no right answers to any of those questions. There's going to be questions where it's generally a question of priorities and values and trade-offs, and very reasonable people can come to very different views about this. And perhaps there is no right answer, but there's some political questions on which I think there ultimately is a right answer, right? So encouraging people to say, tell me about this belief. Tell me about how you came to think this. Explain to me why that is how you think about the world. Obviously, opens up the conversation in a way that I think is really helpful and gets us into the meat of it. But I worry that it might lead to the slightly unsatisfying, okay, so now I can sort of like anthropologically describe you, and you can anthropologically describe me, right? We've sort of like made contact between the tribes, and we can report back to our own tribes about some of their customs. And rather than saying, isn't it disgusting that they do this? We now say, isn't it fascinating that they do this? But that somehow still feels a little bit unsatisfying, right? I mean, in the end, you do want to actually reason together in some kind of way. Is that the next step? Is that something that emerges organically? Is that just too much to ask at the beginning? How are we thinking about those next steps?
That is the next step. I mean, this first piece is about building trust. This first piece is about making sure that people feel that they can even be respected and heard, and that this other person they're talking to even believes that they matter. They have to get that out of the way. We all have to get that out of the way. In this world, you approach someone who voted for the other guy, you're going to have that fear. You know, are they on my side or are they not? Well, that's not actually a great question. The better question is, can we have a really interesting exchange? And the first box you have to check is this person going to respect what I actually believe? Or are they going to expect me to perform something? You know, is it going to be like that? And if you want a really deep intellectual reasoning conversation about the tough stuff going on in our world, you have to establish trust that you can be heard for what you really believe. And we talked about cancel culture. That's really tough in a lot of spaces today. So that's job number one. So the reason that I'm talking about get to understanding is because you have to establish some trust before people will even think that you've earned the right to hear what they really think and to have an interesting intellectual conversation. Most of the time people skip all that and they go right to the banter without the trust, which is going to lead to performative whatever, or a bunch of blow up or a lot of anger. And, you know, then each person's going to be more entrenched in how awful the other side is and nothing gets done and nothing moves. So it is the next step. And you're absolutely right that it isn't really truly satisfying without it. Now, I have done this with my parents multiple times and it's been awesome. It's gotten to the point where, you know, me and my mother, completely different views on everything you can imagine. And it's gotten to the point where we can even learn together. You know, we've done this so much with each other. We've established so much trust that we're on the phone and we're talking about, you know, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, you know, she was overjoyed and I was crying and we're on the phone. And I told her, Mom, I'm really worried about the precedent this sets for the Supreme Court, you know, maybe other things like the right to gay marriage. My understanding is that there's some precedents about this. And she was curious enough because we've established enough trust. She said, I didn't know that. Is that right? And I said, yeah. And she was like, can we look that up? And I said, yeah. And so we looked it up. And together we saw that together, right? Which almost never happens because we all look at phones, screens, you know, it's all an individual experience. So in other words, what I'm saying is once you establish that trust, that's when you can then say, okay, I hear you and I understand you. You know, let me check my understanding. Like you think abortion, you're concerned about the conversation about abortion because of this. Is that right? Yes. Okay. I see it differently. Can I tell you what I mean? And after you have, this works like a charm. After you've spent time listening to someone else and they really feel like you understand them, despite all odds, against all odds, you understand something about what they believe, they are going to return the favor. And then you can give your piece in a way they can actually receive. And you can tell the story how you came to believe it. Well, here's how it feels for me on abortion right now. And that's where things I call I never thought of it that way moments can happen. Oh, I never thought of it that way. I never thought of it that way. I never thought of it that way. I can see what you mean. Okay, now you're establishing a little more of a baseline. And so it's like you're climbing this hill. You're climbing this mountain, and the air is getting thinner. You need to stop and check in with each other. Do you still see me? Do you still respect that I disagree with you? Do you actually respect it? You do? You still understand me? Oh my God, cool. Let's go farther. Let's go higher. And that's how me and my dad have had like 3-hour conversations, you know, intellectually going into how Trump handled COVID, for example. So you can get there. But again, we have boxes we need other people to check for us. Will you respect me for what I actually believe? Or will you just interrupt and judge me? Will you assume horrible things about me? Will you do it right out the gate? Will you actually give me the gift of listening to me uninterrupted for a couple of minutes? These things are difficult in the moment, but when we do it, that's when we can get to that next step. You know, that's when we can say, wait a minute, what actually is the best policy on abortion? But we're not going to get there without those other pieces.
If a conversation gets a little bit more adversarial and a little bit more contentious, is that necessarily a bad thing? So I have in mind, one very close friend of mine who's a friend from college. We've known each other a very long time. We have some genuinely different political beliefs about the world, but more than that, we just love to think about the world and debate the world, and on specific issues we'll end up with very, very different views. So it's not so much that sort of, in general we have completely different ways of thinking about the world, but on particular issues, we'll stumble upon something where we really have different views. And often that conversation, I think, would look incredibly unfruitful from the outside, because we do get stuck in our positions and we're trying to make arguments, and hopefully some of them are good arguments, but some of them are bad arguments. We're grasping at whatever way we can demolish the other person's position. But because we have a great underlying respect for each other, and because we have a relationship of trust, we've known each other for a long time, I think we clearly think of each other as good people, our friendship can withstand the heat in those moments, even if in that moment we sometimes are kind of pissed with each other, right? And I think in retrospect, we often change our minds. So in the situation, we don't change our minds. But reflecting on the conversation over the course of the next weeks, over the course of the next months, we might end up sort of shifting what we think. And it seems to me that's actually often how persuasion does happen. It can be in these kind of like, oh, I finally see the world from this other person's point of view, and it's a very non-conflictual kind of nearly eureka moment revelation, right? But it can also be, I defend my corner as strongly as I can in a moment of heat, but the arguments from the other person still kind of seep in. And over time, when I'm calmer, when I'm in a slightly different situation, when perhaps I have an argument with somebody who's even more on the other side of the argument, like on my side of the argument, but even more so, and suddenly I realize, oh, that kind of feels off, right? Something about those arguments that I wasn't accepting at all in the moment, and where I was using all of my energy to try and get rid of those arguments, they actually end up persuading me over time. And so sort of, can there be a role to good, old-fashioned, more conflictual shouting at each other?
Definitely, 100%. And I mean, that's heaven. That's it. That's where we all want to get to, Because, I mean, now you're making me think, like, I need to draw this out. Because in the beginning, when there's low trust, not a lot of knowledge of each other, and you're not sure, okay, you may have to kind of walk softly, make sure that you don't trigger the other person's, because they've got high radar for, I just need one reason to think that this person's out to get me, and I'm out, right? So you got to tread carefully with each other for a little while, right? But yeah, if you already have the relationship, then the heat that you give each other, that's just crazy. No, that's stupid. That's stupid, Yascha. And if somebody can tell you that, then you feel a little pang. But you know that pang is not trying to undermine you, just your idea. And so that pang may actually get your brain to open up a little wider, And like, I do that with some of my friends, and it is amazing, We sort of break all the rules because we don't need them anymore. Do you know what I mean? And like, imagine if our members of Congress could talk to each other like that. Which, by the way, I've been studying American history, and the folks in the Constitutional Congress did talk to each other like that. Right? That's how they were able to form this incredible democratic republic in the first place.
And it's in part because they had these backward high trust relationships with each other that then allowed them to. Yeah.
Yes. And so we're trying to save our democracy without that. We can't.
Interesting. That's really persuasive. I want to shift gears for a moment and take this conversation out of politics. It's natural that this is a conversation about politics, and that it's politics that's driving the refusal to engage with each other in this kind of way. There is also a kind of cultural trend in this moment of people often getting estranged from each other. And a kind of therapeutic set of justifications for people getting estranged from each other. I think the empirical evidence of whether people are more estranged now than in the past is a little shaky. I'm not sure that I'm fully convinced by it. But I do think that our culture gives us a lot of excuses to become estranged from each other at this moment, right? If there is something that you're unhappy with in your upbringing, something that you blame your parents for, and really, who can't say that about their parents? But I think that must be true of everybody who is a sentient human being, right? There's a lot of encouragement to say, well, if your friend is toxic, if they don't fully see you for who you are, if they don't fully serve your interests in the right way, well, cut them out. That's the healthy thing to do. And perhaps if your little sister or if your older brother is toxic, quote unquote, then you should cut them out as well. And perhaps if your mother or father didn't fully affirm you in the way that you wanted to live your life, wasn't fully supportive in every way that you wanted to be seen and helped by them, well, perhaps they're toxic and you should cut them out of your life. And so I do think that there is sort of countervailing to the message that you and other people in this space are trying to give about being in conversation and dialogue with each other. There's a very strong kind of cultural message about, if something is bothering you in your life in an interpersonal relationship, the solution is not to try and have grace for each other and to understand each other. It's,
Right.
that person is an irritant. That person is, dangerous, and to heal, you have to cut them out.
Right.
Do you share
Right.
this worry, and what would you say to people who, I guess, see some value in that way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, there is some value in that way of thinking about it. It is deeply, deeply, deeply personal, though. It's not the thing that I think it's quite right to make universal prescriptions for, or a set of universal expectations. These are personal decisions. I have friends who have cut folks in their families out of their lives. Some of them with a real hope that something changes, others with more finality. And knowing those friends' stories, I can agree with, I can see it. I can see why they made that choice and how it made them happier and allowed them the freedom they need to make some choices out of a self-determination and not feel oppressed, so much by folks who just feel oppressive. Now, all that said, I think the key word here, the word that's really high on my heart these days, is discernment. Discernment. Because I think what's happening is that folks are jumping to this very quickly. And making very, very giant personal decisions with enormous consequences. I sometimes I worry that there's not enough discernment. Slow it down. Think about this. Query your heart today and tomorrow and the next day. Talk to folks you trust about these decisions. There's so much here. Now, there's one friend of mine who grew up with parents who are Jehovah's Witnesses, and she realized she was queer. She's in a beautiful married relationship with her partner, and her father ended up showing up almost as a surprise on her 40th birthday party, like flew all the way to Seattle from Miami to celebrate with her. And this was a big deal because for many, many years, her father could not reconcile his traditional faith convictions with acceptance of his daughter in the way his daughter really wanted from him. And so my friend, I remember having this conversation with her where she kind of told me the insight that she ended up having. She did not burn the bridge. She got distance from her family to figure out who she was and feel a little more like she could spread her wings. Like, okay. But she kept the relationship and went back and visited. Sometimes it was painful, sometimes it wasn't. And by the way, this is her story. This is not a prescription for anyone else. What she realized after a while, in the beginning, she was thinking about, as you do, you think about your own pain. Of course you do. You think about the injustice coming to you. Of course we do. That's what we do. We have to protect ourselves. After a while, she realized there was a story that there was a path her father was walking as well. And she realized that what her father needed to do, and it took a long time, because how could it not? He needed to break himself, and then remake himself into the father who could have convictions in his faith that he needed to give his life purpose and meaning, and accept his daughter exactly for who she was. That was a long and painful journey for him, too. And so she just came to this place where she's like, it was so hard to hold on this long, but she ended up being grateful she did. Now, that's an extreme example. That is one story. But it's a story that's in my heart. I think that there is a courage and patience. And I think one of the most important thing you can do with a bridge, the rhetorical bridge that is merely a connection to somebody who has a different view than you, the most important thing you can do with a bridge is not to cross it. It's to keep it. Because the world is telling you to burn the bridge for your own good. Keep it. Keeping it means you don't have to talk to that person for years, but just don't tell them that they're out of your life. Like, let the time and the love be, if you can, because it can have power. Time can have power. I've seen so many relationships that have been burned by politics repaired by patience and courage and time and the love that it takes to hold on that long. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I will say I've had the privilege of not having had to take steps like that. But I've seen the relief in friends who didn't go all the way to burn the bridge, right? They didn't do it too quickly. Sometimes you get what you want. Sometimes you get the love you needed, but it's not just changing yourself is hard work. Changing yourself is very hard work. And some of these convictions and some of these beliefs out there stand in a contradiction that is tough to face and to embrace and to accept. And that work happens in somebody's heart, and it can take a while. But if you're still there, if you're still around, you're giving that person a reason to keep working.
That was a really beautiful answer. And I like your point about discernment. Of course, there are some circumstances in which cutting somebody out of your life is absolutely the right way to act. If somebody genuinely is a malignant narcissist, if somebody genuinely has no concern for your well-being, if somebody genuinely is sadistic and gets pleasure out of your suffering, pleasure of your dependence, absolutely. Don't come to the judgment lightly, right? The thing that worries me in some of this kind of therapeutic language is the encouragement that if you don't feel fully seen and supported by everybody in your life at all times, then there must be something wrong with that. And of course, it's impossible to aim for that kind of perfection. In no relationship will you always feel seen. Your best friend who you like the best, some days they're going to have their own shit going on in their own head, and you meet up and you're trying to tell them about something that's important to you, and they just don't show up for you in the right way. That doesn't mean they're a bad person. That doesn't mean that friendship is worth burning down. It means you'll repair and try again another day. And so I think that discernment between, don't be naive about this. Come to have a realistic view. And if some people in your life are just never going to give you what you need from them, then perhaps you should distance yourself. And perhaps in the extreme case, you do even burn that bridge. But that should be a very reasoned, hard decision. And that perhaps is a parallel to the political scene, right? I don't want to pretend that everybody, that there's no differences in value that there might be between you and me that are sufficiently fundamental that I don't want to have a conversation with you.
Right.
I don't want to pretend that everybody in our politics in the end just has, honorable intentions and they just want the world to be a better place in a different way from you or me. No, some people are engaging in politics as an outlet for the cruelty or sadism.
Absolutely.
Some people just have values that are so fundamentally different to me, but are so fundamentally abhorrent to me, but I have no interest in talking to them. But I have discernment about that. If you think that that's true of 50% of your country, if you think that's true of most people, if you think that's true of 80 or 90% of people in your country, as I think some people do, well, then I don't think you have a discernment to do justice to your compatriots.
That's right. And you gave a really interesting, you said a word that I think is so important, which is repair. Repair. Thanks to the cancel culture cycles we've been in the last few years, people have lost faith in repair. So we talked about how the issues are high stakes. Well, the potential consequences of making a wrong move in a conversation are also far too high stakes. We've lost our faith in repair, right? But in more trusting times, if I hurt you, I can say sorry in a way that I mean, and that you come back to the conversation. And these days, boy, we've done such a great job putting out signals that there are some ways you could hurt me that are just so horrible that I don't even want you around. Unfollow if you disagree. Let's just draw those trenches out on social media so that if you see me in real life, you're terrified of ever talking about that particular issue, Israel, Gaza, or who knows where I've drawn a hard red line, and you're terrified, and I'm terrified. I'm terrified that I'll be a bad person if I even engage with someone who thinks the opposite of me in Israel, Gaza, or something like that. And these lines that we draw, but it all comes from this place where, look, humanity thrives. Conflict needs healthy cycles of rupture and repair. There is no such thing as a society that can have the conversations it needs to have in a healthy democracy without messing up a lot. So what we need is to raise our capacity for messing up, because I don't know you. Like, even I offend my husband. I've known him how long? We don't know each other that well. and I don't know myself that well. I'm often surprised by the things that trigger me, right? So we're not going to get to the point where go get educated, read my entire social media profile, then come talk to me. Even then, I don't care how many things you billboard about yourself. If we're going to have a real conversation, then we have to accept the risk of hurting each other. But we can only do that if we also have faith that we can repair. And so we are on such pins and needles with each other. We've lost faith in repair. We don't show examples of it. We don't tell stories about it. People think it's not real. And so no wonder they're burning the bridges.
Mónica Guzmán.
Because we can't repair. But we can, and we have to.
Mónica Guzmán, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Yascha. This was amazing. Thank you.